Welcome all to day 3 of the 10th edition of the Pune International Literary Festival 2020. We now begin our most awaited, most interesting and intriguing session. Yours truly, Anthony Horowitz, J.D. Barker and J Thorn in conversation with celebrity mystery writer Horowitz. We will now begin this session by seeing a short film by Mr. Anthony Horowitz. I now request to play the film.
Anthony Horowitz is one of the most prolific, multi-talented and successful writers. Born in Stanmore, Middlesex, he is an English novelist and screenwriter specialized in mystery and suspense who is juggling writing books, TV series, films, plays and journalism. He has also written for television, contributing scripts to ITV's Agatha Christie's Poirot and Midsummer Murders. He was the creator and writer of the ITV series Foyle's War, Collision and Injustice and the BBC series New Blood. Anthony has written over 40 books including the best-selling teen spy series Alex Rider. Alex Rider was adapted into a movie that was released worldwide in 2006. The Alex Rider series is estimated to have sold 19 million copies worldwide. He is the writer and creator of award-winning drama series Foyle's War, which was the winner of the Lou Grade Audience Award for BAFTA. Anthony has also written other original complex dramas for ITV, particularly thrillers. He has also written 2 highly acclaimed Sherlock Holmes novels, The House of Silk and Moriarty, and a James Bond novel, Trigger Mortis. His most recent standalone novel, Magpie Murders, was a top 5 Sunday Times bestseller. He is on the board of the Old Vic Theatre, and was awarded an OBE for his services to literature in January 2014. Anthony is on the board of the Old Vic Theatre. He regularly contributes to a wide variety of national newspapers and magazines on subjects ranging from politics to education and currently has a travel column in The Telegraph. His latest crime novel, The Word is Murder, introducing Detective Daniel Hawthorne, was a Sunday Times bestseller. He has won numerous awards, including the Bookseller Association, Nielsen Author of the Year Award, the Children's Book of the Year Award at the British Book Awards, and the Red House Children's Book Award. It is our privilege to meet such an inspiring personality. We are honored to welcome Anthony Horowitz to Pune International Literary Festival 2022.
That was absolutely amazing. Now let us begin by me telling you more about our other guest, J.D. Barker. Jonathan Dylan Barker is a New York Times and international best-selling author of numerous novels. His latest, with James Patterson, Death of the Black Widow, released on April 19th. His books have been translated in 24 languages and sold in more than 150 countries and optioned for both film and television. Our next guest, J Thorn. J Thorn has published 2 million words and 2 million books worldwide. He is an official member of Science Fiction and Writers of America. J.D. Barker and Zach Gordon have interviewed shows and interviewed most amazing successful authors including Matthew McConaughey, James Patterson, Seth Godin, Nicholas Spark, and many more. I now request our special guest to begin this conversation.
Gentlemen, welcome. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. How's it going?
This is going to be fun. I normally see Jay on Thursdays for our podcast, so it's a special opportunity. I get to see him twice in a week.
And I'm very excited. I'm the only one here with a name, with a first name.
Yeah, you
sets me aside.
J Horowitz. I like the sound of that.
Well, excellent, gentlemen. We're going to have a fun conversation today talking about literature and writing and publishing and all things related to the author life. So welcome. I guess we don't need to do introductions. Seems like that's been taken care of for us. Anthony, that's a great video you got there. I
loved watching it. There was so much stuff I didn't know.
Yeah,
it's not a deliberate mistake. The here and there. I mean, my life changes so fast. They can't keep up with me. By the time the film's made, I've sold more books. Or I've been given another. Something else has happened. I love forward motion in life.
You've written like 2 or 3 other books since that was
Since
actually done.
that was just a tweet, of course,
I just
yeah,
finished
right.
reading 2 of them that they didn't even mention.
I do. I write too much for my own good. What do you do, guys? You do about. I mean, look at you. You're sitting there with so many books behind you, and they're all by you as well.
Yeah, that's my wall of translations and all the foreign countries. They do this weird thing. Like I'm still trying to figure out why publishers do this, and I'm sure you deal with it too. But every time they do a reprint, they send me a case of books. Which is cool if it's in English, but like I got 4 or 5 cases of Russian copies of my books just sitting in the garage, and like I don't know what to do with them. So in my office, I stack all of my own books and kind of hide them in here, and then we've got a library in the bigger part of the house for normal books.
What you just said is actually such a big problem here, because I was mentioning to you earlier, I've just moved house and I was unloading book. I mean, what do I do with 10 copies of Moriarty in Estonian? It's sort of, it's nice to know I'm out there, and I'm very, I'm so excited about the fact that murder mystery and books bring countries and bring people together, and my books are all over the world. But one is enough. And I think what with with our view on the environment about air travel and shipping out stuff and paper and trees and all the work, publishers should wise up. All we want, maybe 3 or 4 in English, but 1 in any other language will be fine.
That would be fantastic. That's going to be my goal for 2023. Make that happen.
We should all unite. Yeah, one book wonders.
Well, that might be an interesting place to start. I think reader behavior and purchasing habits have drastically changed over the past 20 or 30 years. I mean, especially in the United States, trying to find a bookstore is quite a challenge these days. Maybe we'll start with you, JD. From your perspective, what does readership look like these days compared to what it did 10 or 20 years ago?
Well, I'm in a weird place because I'm what they call a hybrid author. So I've got books that are traditionally published. I've got other ones that have been published through my own independent press. And some of my books are a mix of both, where my agent sells English rights to a traditional publisher, and I do the foreign translations in German or French and things like that. So it's getting very convoluted and messy, I guess, in a lot of ways. But I think because the bulk of my books come from the traditional world, I still sell a lot more physical copies, I think, than like most indie authors do. I think most indie authors tend to lean towards ebooks. And also what we see here in the US, like physical books kind of going away to a certain extent. When you travel the world, that's not the case. Like I was in Paris not too long ago, and there were bookstores everywhere. So that I don't know whether ebooks have caught on every place that they're going to, or I don't know if people have pushed back on it. For me personally, I after all these years, I prefer having a physical book in my hand rather than an electronic copy or a Kindle or a phone that's dinging with text messages and notifications. Well, all I want to do is enjoy a book. So like I like picking up a physical book, and I've got a feeling that shift is kind of going back in the other direction, that pendulum.
I'm so with what you just said. Can I just jump in and just agree?
Yeah.
It's a strange thing. I remember that when the first ebooks arrived, and I forget even now what they were called because they came and went so fast. I mean, that was their problem. And nowadays, there are wonderful ways of getting books onto your computer. And I embrace anything that will put a book into somebody's hands, into their home, no matter in what form or shape it takes. But I think that the trouble with the ebook thing was it never quite caught on to the fact that there is nothing more lovely than a book in your hand. The physicality of a book is very much part of its essence. And, we spend a lot of time thinking about jackets and cover design, quality of the paper, the typeface, all those sorts of things. And there is something about having, first of all, a book in your hand and knowing when you're getting closer to the end. I mean, I have it often. I'm reading an exciting thriller or a whodunit, and I can just tell from the weight in my hand that my left hand has now got more pages in it than my right hand. And that turning of the page, just that physical activity, it's somehow more satisfying when the thing on a screen of a little percentage that on the bottom of it tells you you've got 17 or 12 or 11% still to go. So I think that, and also of course that a book, moving house, I put 3,000 books into this house. And I said, why am I keeping this book? Am I ever going to read it again? What is it doing here? But the truth is that I can look at any book in this house and tell you where I was, how I was, what was happening in my life when that book came into it. They're all friends.
Well, we do this weird thing in my house. My mom owns an antique store. She's retired now. And she used to go to a lot of estate sales, and she would buy books sometimes, like $1 for a case of books that somebody just had at their house. And she actually found me a first edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, just in one of those boxes, original print. And in the very back of it, everybody who had ever read that book had signed it and dated it. which, and I got it. I was about 8 or 9 years old when she gave that to me. And like, it really gave me a very different perspective on books, because like that book had a life, you know, it had been around for almost 100 years. Here were all the people who had read it, the dates that they read it. I wish I would have known where they were physically, but like that book has traveled, you know, probably around the world. And like, I love that. So here in our house, anytime anybody borrows a book, reads a book or whatever, we make them sign the back and date it. So that we have that record. And I'm a father. I've got a 5-year-old. So like now I'm revisiting books, you know, like books that I loved as a kid. Like I grew up without a TV in the house. We were hitting the library when I was like 3 or 4 years old. So like I've had a love of books forever. Now I've got a 5-year-old, and I'm going out trying to find some of these books that I liked when I was a kid that are out of print and difficult to find, and stocking our own library, you know, just waiting for that day when my daughter picks one up and says, hey, you know, what's this about? So I can explain it. It's like, you know, even when I travel, like if I walk into a bookstore, like there's a certain smell in that bookstore that just feels like home. You know, it's a weird thing. And I really hope that doesn't go away.
A bookshop, in my view, is the soul and the lifeblood of any street it's in. A street without a bookstore is somehow, I don't know, it's lost its soul. It's got a sort of an emptiness about it, for me anyway. I mean, it was interesting when, you know, when this session started, what do we see as a sponsor of Straight Up is Amazon this, Amazon there, Amazon everywhere. And of course, we all love Amazon. How did we live before Amazon? But that said, whenever I can, certainly in this country, I support independent bookstores because, you know, unlike huge corporations or even the big chains, they know their customers. They know what customers like, and they can actually ring or visit. You know, when people walk in the store, say, "Hey, you've got to read this book that's just come out. I know you're going to love it." And that sort of friendliness, that, you know, that like us three guys talking now, the way books bring people together. I think the independents are so much at the heart of that, and so long may they continue against, I have to say, all the odds.
It's a meeting place, right? I mean, if it's, you know, if you're in a big city and you live on a particular block, that bookstore is where the neighbors, you know, see each other on a fairly regular basis. You know, like you said, everybody knows everybody, but it's like, it's one of those places we all kind of congregate at. And, you know.
But then we live in a world in which all stores are sort of vaguely disappearing. I mean, my kids, as far as I can tell, never go into any shop of anything. If they want, you know, my son told me the other day, but when he wants to buy a pair of trousers, he'll just buy 3 pairs. And the one that fits, he'll keep. The other 2, he'll send back. And you think, so this is an incredible economy. The amount of money that is now being spent on you know, vans going up and down roads and all the paperwork and whatever to sort of, you know, administer all this. It's extraordinary to sell you whatever it is you want. Different world.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Anthony, I'm going to follow up. I'd like to hear both your guys' opinion on this, but I'll start with you. Where do audiobooks fit into the current marketplace or reading, you know, sphere?
Well, I think audiobooks are wonderful. I mean, again, I embrace anything that gets my stories into people's hands and heads. And I'm very fortunate that my Hawthorne novels and my last James Bond novel were all read by an actor called Rory Kinnear, who has got the most wonderful voice. And I love listening to him reading my books. I'm a character in my books, so I'm hearing my voice and me coming out of him. It's a very weird experience. And you know, audible books have certainly picked up. During COVID, things changed. I mean, people, you know, were looking for different ways to relax. And I noticed that audible books, my sales certainly rose. And I actually had a problem about 4 or 5 years ago. I had an eyesight problem, which I meant my doctor said, look, you mustn't read for, just give your eyes a rest as much as you can. So I started reading listening to audible books. And I was listening to Charles Dickens, my great love. And I had great actors reading Dickens. It's a fantastic experience. I mean, it is so luxurious. If you're in the sunshine as well, you know, paperbacks are specially built, as I'm sure you both know, to disintegrate in the sunshine. So after about 2 hours, they will fall apart in your hands. But to plug in your earpods, sit back in a recliner and listen to a book, it's just a wonderful experience. So I don't know what your question was, Jay, but I'm for them.
Yeah, JD, where do you stand on audiobooks? How do they fit into the picture here?
I honestly love them. I go for a 5-mile run/walk every day to try and figure out what I'm supposed to write the next day. And I always listen to an audiobook. It's just another way for me to consume stuff. It is very odd listening to your own audiobook, which I've had to do recently because I'm working on something related to a series, and I wrote the original ones a while back, and I had to refresh myself on it. So that is a little strange. But it's, they stepped up the game. I mean, there's like I've got a prequel to Dracula that I wrote, and they did a full cast of narrators, which is fantastic to listen to, because one of my pet peeves is, a man doing a female's voice or vice versa. And like, how do you pick a male narrator, a female narrator? And I've been lucky where they've sometimes mixed it up. But it's a very interesting medium. It's definitely picking up in an interesting way. I mean, a lot of people have, I think, discovered it because of COVID, but they're sticking with it, which is nice too.
Excellent. Yeah. Let's shift a little bit here and talk about writing process. I see we're getting some questions coming in here, so I'm going to try and keep my eye on this. Let's start with you, Anthony. Can you tell us a little bit about how you get words on the page, where you do it, what time of day, what's your process?
Gosh, how long do you have? I'll be brief. I work very long days. I tend to start probably about 8 in the morning, and I might work until 11 at night. And I'm writing pretty much the whole day. And when I take my dog out for a walk, which is my main relaxation, I'm still turning ideas over. I am a great believer in structure. So I spend an awful lot of time before I write a word of a book. I mean, not all writers are the same. And anybody listening should be aware that every writer is different. I meet writers who sell huge amounts, and they tell me they sort of pick up a pen and they start the story and see where it takes them. I'm not that sort of person. I have notebooks everywhere. Here's one of them. I can just reach out and show you, where all my books are planned sort of with just page after page of, what's this book? This is a murder mystery. Of suspect lists and everything, and little things about them, and all. And this work will take me Magpie Murders took me something like 12 years to work out. That's extreme. Normally it's about 6 months of thinking before I start writing. And then if it's a murder mystery, I like to think of books having shapes. For me, every book, before it exists in written form, has a shape. It might be a pentagram, or my favorite is a book of mine I called Moriarty, which I always saw as being like a Mobius strip, in the sense that it looped round and back on itself. But once I've then got that shape, I can begin to fill that shape with the words, the 80,000, the 100,000, 150,000 words it's going to take to tell the story. But until I have the structure and the shape, I can't start writing.
JD, I know you have a slightly different process.
I'm still trying to figure out what my process is. We've interviewed pretty much every well-known author out there on our podcast, and we ask them that same question. And everybody, like you said, has a very different process, a very different answer. For me, I started off very much with what you had just mentioned. I would create my plot. I would have that general idea. Then, the bulk of my work went into creating the characters, and then I would just drop them into that particular situation, and I would let them tell the story. And I wrote my first 5-6 books that way. Then I got a phone call from James Patterson, and he asked me to write a book with them. We had lunch together, and I told him I've never used an outline before, and he's a notorious outliner. He has 30 to 60 pages before he starts writing any book. So we kind of thought that was a deal breaker. Stepped away from that lunch, and a couple months went by, and we ended up talking to each other again. He's like, you know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to write a book without an outline. So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to write a book without an outline. And we literally went back and forth chapter by chapter. I would come up with some crazy scenario, paint him into the worst possible corner I could think of, and I would hand it off like, here, Jim, you try to get out of that. And then 15 minutes later, I would get pages back from him, and he would have gotten out of it and came up with something even crazier to throw me into. But when that book was done, he said, okay, now let's try it my way. He sent me an outline for a book called The Noise. And we wrote that one, and the process was just so much faster, so smoother, and very few words actually ended up on the cutting room floor. With that first book, I think we ended up around 160,000. We probably took 60,000 out of it before it was published. With the second one, there was very little to do. The story was there, the framework was there. We had done all the heavy lifting before we hit the ground. So I've kind of been swayed from the camp of just winging it to coming in with a plan, and I've been leaning towards outlines on the last few. Now that may change again in the next couple of years. Who knows?
Can I chip in something else, though, which is the point of an outline? People think that an outline and a structure actually limits you, but what it does is the exact opposite. Because to me, it's like having a map of a country you've never visited or a town you've never visited. You come to London and you don't have a map, which is freewheeling it. Well, you may have a great day. You may sort of find yourself wonderful parks, museums by chance. But if you know that you can visit Hyde Park in the morning and just walk down and do shopping in Piccadilly and maybe pop into the National Gallery in Leicester Square in the afternoon, in Trafalgar Square, sorry. That's your plan. But also a plan tells you can change your mind. You can be somewhere in the book and you can actually decide, I've had a crazy idea. I'm going to just go west for 6 miles and see where I go. But the structure tells you where you've got to get back to. And I think in particular, if you're running murder mystery, which is all about clues and lines coming together and secrets being told and a truth being slowly unveiled, that I can't imagine anybody doing it without having the structure. And that is how I've always worked.
Well, honestly, that realization is that's key. Like, you have to understand that the outline itself isn't carved in stone. It's more or less a guideline. And you can't be afraid to go off that roadmap, like you said, and take a quick detour. When you don't do it, if you fight it, well, the outline says do this, but my characters want to do this, but I'm going to do what the outline says. That's when it doesn't work. So you have to get to that point where you can trust yourself, your subconscious, the story that you've got on paper, the story that the ideas that are coming to you. I'm finding that the outlining process just basically, it allows me to create a more intricate story and think it through far more than I did in the past. If I want to change something, it's very easy to change it on an outline and go back, 30 minutes, I can wipe it out and I completely change the storyline around. If you have to do that on a novel that's, 70, 80,000 words in the can, that's a tough ask. So I'm finding that the storyline is more intricate. It's tighter. I'm wrapping up the threads a lot easier. And when you're doing this on a full-time basis, you have to streamline. It is still a business, and you want it to be fun, but it needs to be efficient as well.
Now, I loved it when you said that when JD, you said that James Patterson, could give you the answers to get your characters out of trouble. Or if you came into an area, how do you get out of it? Because I think that's the other thing about a structure is it doesn't have to be complete. When I'm writing an Alex Rider novel, I'll often get him into some kind of terrible, perilous situation and think to myself, how will I get him out of this? And say, well, I'll find out when I get there. So you write it up, you write your villa with the guards and the Alsatian dogs and the CCTV. Somehow he's got to break out of there. And then it's only when you're in there with him that you realize, of course, that's the way he can get out of it. And I think that's an important part of the creative process. Because if you don't surprise yourself while you're writing, if everything is already known to you, how can you surprise your reader? There's a sort of telepathy here. You want to say, I've got him this far. Now, this is how he's going to get out. And let's all enjoy it together.
Well, I've mentored a lot of writer students, and they tend to lean in the other direction. So if the easy answer is to go through door A, most aspiring authors will go through door A. But in reality, for that to be a good book, you want to send them through door B. You want them to get in their car and it not start. So you want something wrong, some obstacle that they have to overcome. And that's a big part of that. But yeah, like you just said, then you end up painting yourself in a corner. Imagine when you're out walking your dog, that thought is going through your head. Well, I left Alex here. How am I going to get him out of it? But then it comes to you, and it's usually something really cool, really brilliant that somebody wouldn't have thought of before. And that's why it's a good book. So I think that's all of this is part of the process for sure.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question coming up here. I'll pose this to Anthony. I believe it's directed at him. The question is, how does someone with no crime experience, a gentleman or someone without a criminal record, write an engaging murder mystery? And how difficult is that to do?
Well, very difficult question to answer intelligently. I mean, difficult is a word I never use myself, because if something is difficult, I always say something's gone wrong. I think there's something about writing, which is it's to do with flow, it's about self-confidence, and it's about pleasure and enjoyment. If you're sitting there scratching your head, staring at a white page, and you can't find your way forward, maybe it's because you haven't got the structure as we've just been discussing, or maybe it's because the idea isn't as good as you thought it was before you began. So I don't think of difficult as being the answer to this gentleman's question. I guess at the end of the day, it's the same for all of us, whether we are the most successful best-selling author in the world or whether we are somebody who's never written before. It's about just simply picking up a pen, thinking what you want to write, researching your subject, living with it, enjoying it, getting involved in it, immersed in it, and then writing it. I mean, and if how difficult is it to get published? How difficult is it to sell 1 million copies? How difficult is it to make £1 million out of the manuscript? Those aren't the questions. The easy bit is just pick up the pen, know what you want to do, believe in yourself, and do it, and worry about the rest of it later.
I think a lot of it just comes from feeding your brain, right? We were discussing before we started this interview, the books that we have and our love of books, and we've all been lifelong readers. We're constantly feeding our brains with information, just packing all of this in there. So, if you're going to write a serial killer thriller or something that you didn't experience in your real life, chances are you've probably read 50 books about it, or you've seen TV shows about it. Now we've got Google, which makes it even easier to get out there and research. I've worked with mentoring students in the past as well that have told me, well, I want to write this particular book. I want to write a book like Jack Reacher, like a Lee Child type book. Well, what's your favorite one? Well, I've only read one. He's got 30 or 40 books. It's like you can't pigeonhole yourself like that. Like the knowledge comes from the material that we absorb. And it's all out there. I mean, every story's been told at one point or another. We're just finding unique ways to do it.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, when you sit down to write a murder mystery, how much of do you have the crime figured out when you start, or does that sort of come to you in the process?
For me, murder mystery starts with a very simple formula: A plus B equals C. And I would argue that all murder mystery is the same. A is one person, B is another person, C is the reason A murders B. That's where it all begins. I mean, to me, that is, if you imagine a novel as a dartboard, that's the bullseye. That's the bit in the center. That's where everything starts. So let's say that A is JD and B is UJ. Why? And anything I've always thought it'd be absolutely lovely to do a murder mystery where the murder happens during a Zoom. So even though you two guys are supposed to be hundreds of miles apart from each other, somehow one of you manages to murder the other during the conversation. Perfect alibi, by the way. But then I start to think about myself of why would one of you want to murder the other? Now, you do a podcast together, so that's interesting. So you know each other on a personal level. I'm not sure it's very helpful for a novel because it's almost a bit too obvious and a bit too sort of put you too close together. But it could be that, there's going to be some reason. Murder is a big deal. Why would one of you, in this case you, JD, want to murder JD? I mean, and that gets my head going. And once then I've got that thought about a really clever motive, something that hasn't been thought of, not just money, not just, because of love or whatever, but because one of you has gone off the other's partner sort of thing, but a really good, interesting, original motive. Then I can begin to build around it, because both of you have friends, both of you may have partners, but both of you may have many, many people who would like to see either of you dead. And so that dartboard begins to open up. The more I think about it, the more different things that you have done. Who have you met today? What arguments have you had this morning? What has happened in your life that could have made you an enemy that would want to put a knife in you? And it's just a question of expanding, selecting the bits that amuse me, putting it all back together again in this circle, and that's how I end up with the book. But it begins with that very, very simple equation.
That's a great formula. JD, I want to ask you a similar question because you write a serial killer series. What's your approach for that regarding the crime and motivation?
It's sort of what I just mentioned. I read everything that I could find that had been written before. I'm a huge Thomas Harris fan. Then I dissected those books. What in them worked, what didn't work. And try to pick that sort of thing apart. But then you have to come up with something unique, like Anthony just mentioned. You can't have a serial killer that just does it for X. Like you need a unique reason. You need something different. If it's something that if readers have read it before, they're going to immediately tune out. So you have to come up with, maybe it's a unique way that they're killing people, but the reason behind it is also something unique. And you have to twist it. So, when I came up with my 4MK series, I made a list of, famous serial killers, their methods that they used. And then I created a second list of things that weren't on the first list. And the second list is basically what I ended up using in the books.
Excellent. Oh, I was just going to say there was a question that popped up, but I didn't read it in time. There, it's back. Anthony, this is for you about the Magpie murders. The question is around the inspiration for writing the book within a book and having readers solving 2 murder mysteries.
Magpie Murders began with me wanting to write about murder mystery, about writing. 2 books that have really inspired me. I bet you guys will know these books. One for Screen and TV by William Goldman, Adventures in the Screen Trade, just the greatest handbook on how to write for the screen. The other, Stephen King's wonderful book on writing. And I thought because I wrote both and plays, I could do the same. And I started writing it. And it's interesting, I noticed on your website, JD, that you've written 2 million words. is up on your bio. I was going to call this book 10 million words. That's how many words I think I've written. I'm much older than you two guys, so that's that I've had more time. I began to write it, and it was just boring. The moment I started writing about how to write, I was just either pompous or wrong or both. And so then I began to have an idea. Well, supposing I were to write a murder mystery about somebody who writes murder mysteries and do it all as a detective story. And that's how Magpie Murders began its life. It's a book in which I'm able to discuss the world of murder mystery, asking basic questions. Why is a murder on the streets disgusting and horrible and upsetting, but a murder in a book is always an entertainment? Why is it that almost every living writer since day one has at some stage in their life written murder and written death? You know, even Dickens and Shakespeare have written effectively murder stories. Macbeth has been described as one of the greatest murder mysteries of all time. You know, the Macbeths did it. Sorry to be a spoiler there, but you know, so these are questions I was able to ask, but not in a sort of dry, aren't I clever sort of way, which incidentally neither King nor Goldman were. There's a book's a genius, but mine would have been. Instead, I wrote a murder mystery and did it like that.
Ah, excellent. JD, are you still working on a writing book?
You know, it's funny. I sold a writing book years ago, and I keep going back and revisiting it. And the process has changed so much. The environment has changed so much. It's constantly evolving. I don't know that I'll ever get that finished. And the funny thing is, you know, like On Writing is probably one of my all-time favorites. And if you go through and actually pick that book apart, the first half or 2/3 are really autobiographical. They're not even on the process of writing. It's basically, this is what happened to Stephen King in his life, you know, before he got to the, before he actually gets to the nuts and bolts of it. And my other favorite book on writing is one with Lee Child. It's called Reacher Said Nothing, where a reporter basically just camped out on Lee's couch while he was writing one of the books. You know, so Lee is sitting at a desk writing the book, reporter is sitting there watching him write the book. But it's so well written. And I think the fact that those are both different, I think, is what makes me gravitate towards them. And I don't want to write another how-to manual. And honestly, like, I don't think you can teach people how to write. You know, this is something that I've discovered over the years. I think people are either born, you know, storytellers or they're not. I don't think you can teach the storyteller gene. You can teach the mechanics of it, you know, the grammatical portion and you know, the sentence structure and all those fun things. But actually how to tell a story, you know, you just can't teach that. And that's evident if you visit any MFA, you know, class and talk to the instructor. You know, there's going to be one kid in there who probably had no training whatsoever. He might be the best storyteller in there. And then you've got the other ones that have been studying the process their entire life. They've read every book on craft, and you know, they still can't write something compelling. It's weird. It's a strange dynamic, but there's something, you know, something going on there.
Interesting question here. We'll start with you on this one, Anthony. They say thoughts become action. So what about a writer who thinks murder and crime all the time?
They write a lot of books. Is the action that comes out of it, Renaud? I mean, there have been many books written about authors who think they can get away with murder because they've written about it so much and they think they're going to be cleverer than the police. And there are likewise stories of, obsessional murderers in that world. But for me, you got to bear in mind that I don't write real crime. I mean, I'm writing what's called golden age crime, or other people call comfy crime. I don't like that phrase, comfy crime, because I don't think crime is ever comfy, even if the world it's happening in feels sort of very familiar and warm to us. But it's I don't buy that thinking about murder will lead you to the act of murder. To me, it leads me to the act of writing about murder.
Honestly, Psychology 101 would tell you somebody that actually writes about it on a regular basis is getting it out of themselves. And it's probably a therapeutic thing to do. So, I've yet to meet a serial killer that was an aspiring author first.
Well, now, Hannibal Lecter, of course, the greatness of him was he was a great reader. He was culturally very in tune and he was very aware of himself. I think it must be hard work writing serial killer books, given Tom Harris's extraordinary it's like writing in the shadow of Sherlock Holmes, which I do. Although fortunately, the shadow is a long way away from me. But Harris, he's not writing anymore, is he? I think. But his last Hannibal Lecter was only 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Cara Morta about 4 years ago now. That had nothing to do with Hannibal Lecter. I believe he's 80 some years old. He's living on Miami Beach, probably just enjoying himself. But
He owns Miami Beach.
pretty much at this point. But he did leave Hannibal running around out there in the world. Like he really should tie up that loose string.
Well, JD, in all seriousness, like I know you've talked about the challenges with writing a serial killer series. Can you talk about that? Because I think it kind of gets to the heart of the previous question.
Well, a lot of it has changed for me since becoming a father. You know, there's a lot of horrific things that I've done in books that, you know, if I were to try and sit down and write that today, it probably wouldn't come out of my head. And there was also a lot of material, a lot of times where I pushed the computer across the desk because something came out of my head and I had to take a little bit of a break. But over the years, I've learned to trust my subconscious. I listen to the characters when the story is working, when it's flowing, it's almost like watching a movie, and I'm just sitting there documenting it as fast as I possibly can. So the characters tend to do things that I may not agree with, but you know, I get it down on paper, and usually that cringeworthy stuff that you know, when they surprise me, that's the reader's favorite part as well.
Yeah. We had a question pop up about Sherlock Holmes. I'm sorry, I didn't. Oh, there it is. Anthony, how would you describe Sherlock Holmes, and is Moriarty also your favorite villain?
Well, Moriarty is an absolutely wonderful villain because so little is known about him. If you think about it, Moriarty appears in one Sherlock Holmes story only as a person. He's mentioned in 2 more. There aren't that many stories, but somehow he has captured our imagination for, 200 years plus. And he is one of the greatest villains in literary history. So he is my favorite villain. And I very much admire what Doyle did. How would I describe Sherlock Holmes? I would describe him as the grandfather of the modern detective. He is where everything begins, in the sense that, he was, I think, the first detective to have a sidekick in Watson. He was also the first detective to actually be a detective by profession, unlike Dupin, who is the creation of Edgar Allan Poe. Have I got the right name, Dupin or Dupin? And he is the benchmark for me of the great detective. That said, it's interesting how very few ordinary or real crimes he ever investigates. There aren't that many murders in Sherlock Holmes. It's a strange thing about it. What there are strange conspiracies, people doing weird things for different reasons. The Red-Headed League is one of my favorite books. The idea that there should be a group of gangsters who are all connected by the color of their hair. It's such a Doyle idea. So it's a very fantastical, almost a surreal world, but nonetheless, from Sherlock Holmes, you go almost directly to Agatha Christie. Poirot and Hastings could not have existed without them. She herself admitted as much. And without Agatha Christie, quite frankly, you wouldn't have me.
Yeah. JD, any thoughts on Sherlock Holmes?
I mean, I started reading it when I was a kid. By far, some of my favorite books. Agatha Christie, Charles Dickens is probably my favorite author. Great Expectations is, I think, my favorite book. You have to, I think, if you want to play in this world, if you want to be an author, you need to read all of those, because they are the grandfathers, grandmothers of this particular industry. Like everything that I learned about craft and story structure came from reading those books, not books on craft, but actually reading an Agatha Christie book. And, she did A, then she did B, and then it went to here, and then it went to here. Like that structure gets ingrained in your head. But the storytelling process, everything about them, like they were so good at it. And I'm trying to find ways to keep those books alive in today's world, because it's just, in a lot of ways, I think they're getting lost. And they really should be, I think, the basis for a lot of this stuff.
JD, lovely to hear you say that Our Great Expectations is your favorite book. It's mine too. I think as a writer, there are some books you look at and they are so perfect in every single way, and their stature is so great, and you read them. I don't know how many times you've read it. I must have read it 3 or 4 or 5 times in my life, and every time you read it, you find out not only something new in the book, but something new about yourself. And Dickens is. I wish I could point to his book. I have a collection of his books downstairs, a beautiful edition I bought some years ago, and I go back to it every year. I read one of them.
There's certain books that are just like that. They take on a different meaning as you read them at different times of your life. I think I was 8 or 9 when I read Great Expectations the first time, and I've read it a bunch of times since then, and I'm way too old at this point to admit how many times I've actually seen it. Dracula was another one. That was the first adult book I ever read. I was 8 years old when I picked that one up, and it scared the crap out of me. But then I visited it again in my teens and again in my 20s. I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family a few years back, and I got to see his original notes, which was a crazy experience. But a lot of these classic books, like they take on a different meaning every time you pick them up, and you do discover something a little more each time. Which is another, I can't say that necessarily about a modern book. There's very few modern books that I've reread over and over again where I've, wanted to revisit them and you get those little kernels.
It's one of the great challenges of life, which is I could actually just read 19th century literature for the rest of my life. But at the same time, I've got to read contemporary authors. I've got to see what people like yourselves are doing and what other crime writers are doing and what people are enjoying. And anyway, I like to be connected to the world I live in through story, but at the same time, I'm thinking, how many more years have I got? How many more times can I read Dickens? And if I'm going to start a new book by a modern writer, it's time not spent in my favorite century. It's one of those little problems, challenges one has in later life.
Yes, for sure. We have roughly 10 minutes or so remaining. This might be a good time, and this is a good segue based on what you just said, what you guys both just said. But I know that you're both in a position where writers who are new to the craft or folks who are early on in their author journey are going to ask you for advice. So, what are a couple things that you say, other than reading a lot? What are a few things that you tell new writers when they ask you what they should be doing?
JD, after you.
The first one is I tell everybody to write every day. Even if it's only if you write 200 to 300 words a day, you'll have a novel in a year. But more importantly, I think it builds the storytelling process in your own head. I run into so many people that tell me they're authors and they want to be writers. And well, when do you write? Well, sometimes on Sunday I get 2 or 3 hours. If I'm lucky, a couple times a month, like that kind of thing. Like I know me doing this even professionally, like I couldn't tell a story like that. My writer voice would change by the time I finished it because it would take so long to get the book out of me. I think writing is very much like going to the gym and exercising. You need to work that muscle every single day and you need to stay on top of it. If you take time off, if I leave for a vacation or a conference and I don't write over that week or two and I come back, it's very difficult to get back into the process. You have to build back up, very similar to going to a gym. So if it's something you want to do, you need to do it every day.
I love listening to JD because it's like finding a soulmate here. And the things you say are the things that I've been thinking and saying myself for years and years. And I certainly agree with you. I used to say to people, people say to me, I'm too busy to write. And I say, well, if you get up half an hour earlier and you just write, 200 words, a year from now, you've got a novel. So, and I actually quite mistrust people who say they want to be authors because actually wanting to be an author and being an author are far away. I mean, I'm an author. I'm holding a pen. Now I'm an author. I write one word. I'm an author. You don't need to think about it. And I think that sort of distancing yourself from it as if it's going to be something difficult and challenging. So writing every day, I agree with that. Obviously, reading a lot is part of it. But I think at the end of the day, something you said earlier, JD, that you were talking about whether universities and courses can teach writing. I think that the biggest thing about writing is that writers aren't not many writers decide to become writers. The majority of writers are writers. They're born writers. There is no plan B, no second option. Somebody like me has no other skills besides my ability to put words down on the page. And so therefore for me, it's no choice. Now I have met one or two writers who needed money. They just said, I've got to make money. And so I'm going to write a best-selling novel. And to my horror, well, not to my horror, good luck to them, but it doesn't seem fair that they wrote the book and it did make the money. I think that writing is about immersion and about having a wonderful time. It's about feeding that desire inside you to tell the story and just going where it takes you and not worrying about agents and contracts and publishers and booksellers and bookseller lists and awards. Just the story. Live the story, enjoy it. That's my advice.
Honestly, like you hit on a very strong. I've been writing my entire life, not because it's something that would earn money, but because it was something I did for fun. I got pushed into the corporate world. I went to college. I worked in finance for 2 decades, but I would come home and I would write to stay sane. So like it's something that's always been there as a comfort to me. And yeah, a lot of the people that I meet, I want to write a book someday. I want to do this. I've got an idea for a book, but like they've never sat down and actually done it. Meanwhile, everybody that I know that's actually working in this field, they have been writing their entire life. It's something they enjoy to do. They don't, there's some people that claim to be authors that, hate putting their butt in the chair. Like I want to be a writer, but I don't want to have to write, because it's hard.
It's tough. I mean, writing a whole novel, writing down to the isolation that you and I, maybe all three of us, have to have in our lives, a number of hours we spend on our own, the crises of confidence we have to put up with, the sort of sense of just almost a loneliness that sort of comes with the job and the slog of it. I often think to myself, when a lorry has backed up behind me, a truck, and it opens up and like 100,000 words are pouring over my shoulder for me to arrange once again on the page. I finished a novel last week, and just the exhaustion of it, that was my 57th novel. And I sort of, how much more of this stuff can I do? But at the end of the day, it's all I do. It is the joy of a spark, the reason for me to be alive. And most of the writers I know, most and not all, would say the same.
Lovely. Well, that's a great segue. And maybe we could wrap up this way. I'd like to ask each of you what you're working on now, or what's on the near horizon for you. Anthony, we'll start with you.
Well, the novel I finished yesterday was Alex Rider number 14. And there'll still be some more work to do polishing that. But in a week's time, I'm going to start Hawthorne number 5, which is in the series that began with The Word is Murder. And The Twist of a Knife was published just last week in America and has come out here. So book 5 in that will be the next book I write.
Excellent. How about you, JD? What are you working on?
Well, I've got a crazy schedule. So I've got one book I'm finishing up right now that I owed my agent 3 months ago. Got another phone call from James Patterson with an idea. Hey, would you like to work on this? So we've been talking that one out. I've got a number of books that are in various stages of what I call Hollywood hell. And one of them, they've asked me to write the screenplay. And I've been toiling over that for a little bit. I'm hoping to wrap that one up in the next couple of months. That's a whole other world. And I wish we had time to talk about that as well, because I know Anthony has done quite a bit in that. But it's a very different animal than writing a book, for sure.
So true.
Well, we've got a few minutes.
Luck with it as well.
I mean, we've got a few minutes. Anthony, would you be willing to talk just, in generalities about, what authors can do if they kind of want to see their story on the big screen?
Well, first of all, ask themselves if the big screen is the place for it. Don't forget now that most of the stuff being made is being made for the small screen, or which has actually become quite big anyway. But TV is where it's at. Now, I think getting a film made, a movie now, is pretty much not impossible, but very, very difficult. So I would start thinking about television. And in terms of how to get there, God, over to you, JD. I don't know what the route to getting. I have stuff being made for film and TV at the moment, or for TV anyway, because my wife is a producer and such. It's all about agents. It's about agents and producers. It's your agent introducing your work to the right producer who has the faith in it to develop it, to get the money into it. It's I think my advice to people is write books. Books is you have the control. Books is where, and if you write a great book, a great TV series or even a great movie may come out of it. But at least you have the control of it, and you don't need to go to somebody else to pay you the money to make it.
Somebody told me once, if you watch the credits at the end of a movie, basically all of those people had to come together in order for that movie or that TV series to actually happen. You take one of those names out, and there's a chance that it probably would have made it to the screen. It's such a perfect storm of different pieces that all have to come together. I honestly think it's for me anyway, it's very difficult to adapt my own book because, in this case, like I wrote the book, I trimmed out, I think of it almost like a piece of steak, and I'm trimming away the fat when I'm going through the editing process and getting into the leanest piece of meat that I possibly can before it goes off to my agent. So in my mind, the book is already, like the best of the best of the best. But then you have to take that and try to whittle it down into a 2-hour or something, which means you've got to cut another 50-60% of it out in order to get that story told. I think for me, I'm just a little too close to be able to do it. It's funny. We had Gillian Flynn on the podcast, and we talked to her about this and how she worked with David Fincher. And she said that the first draft of Gone Girl that she wrote was 4.5 hours long. And then they basically worked their way backwards. So it's a very difficult process, but I do agree with Anthony. I think I've had a lot of conversations with producers and directors When they start, when they're leaning towards a feature film, they start telling you about everything they have to take out of the project in order to get it to that point. And when you're talking about television or a series or a limited series, not only can they tell the entire story that you want to tell, but they can a lot of times tell it better than you probably could in a book. I've had them reach out and ask for material that I cut from the book to give them new material to put in there. So it's a better medium. And I personally, I enjoy watching a series more than I enjoy watching a movie at this point.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And it is about killing your babies to a certain extent. I so understand what you're saying. Your book is perfect. Now you've got to take that out and change that. But you look at Magpie Murders, which has just been done as a 6-part TV series for PBS in America. That was a 650-page book, which I turned into 6 1-hours. And what the joy of it was not only cutting out whole swathes of the book, but adding completely new material that wasn't in the book, because I realized that this is a different animal. And people watching a show are not the same as somebody reading a book. And so it's not at the end of the day about your work. It is about the genre. And making that jump into the next genre means you can't start by saying, this is perfect. I'm not changing a word. You're saying this was perfect. How do I make a perfect TV series out of it?
Lovely. Well, I just want to say thanks to both of you gentlemen. Really enjoyed spending some time with you today, and hope the viewers and listeners got a lot of great pieces of advice came out of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
It was certainly a mesmerizing, fascinating, and captivating discussion. Thank you, Anthony Horowitz, J.D. Barker, and J Thorn for being our special PILF guests. We thank you all for being with us on this literary journey. We hope you enjoyed being the part of the same. On this note, we end Day 3 of Pune International Literary Festival 2020. We hope you all had a smashing time. We thank our title sponsor, Vishwakarma Publications, silver partner SBI, bronze partner Bajaj Allianz, and our bookstore partner Crossword. Thank you and good night. Bonne nuit.